The debt had been outstanding for 11 months, which in Joran Kaz's experience was the length of time it took an outstanding debt to transition from a problem that would be resolved to a problem that would not be resolved without a different kind of conversation. He had been having the different kind of conversation with himself for 3 of those 11 months, building toward the version he was going to have with Vorath. And on a morning that was otherwise unremarkable, he walked into the back room of Heth Station's secondary cargo exchange and had it. Vorath's response was not the credit transfer Joran had prepared for. Vorath's responses were rarely what Joran prepared for, which was why doing business with Vorath was the kind of experience that taught you things about your own decision-making in the way that only genuinely bad decisions could. "Payment in kind," Vorath said, with the practiced smoothness of someone who had said this before and had developed, through repetition, the specific tone that made it sound like a reasonable option rather than an attempt to convert an uncomfortable situation into a worse one. "Clean transaction, asset in good condition, settles the debt in full at current market valuation, which I have had independently assessed." He produced a document that Joran did not read because the document was not the relevant thing. The relevant thing was the woman standing in the room's corner. She was Vethali. The long tapered ears, the bone structure, the specific coloring that the station's population included enough of to make the identification reflexive in someone who had been doing business on Heth Station for 11 years. She was standing with the quality of someone who had arrived at stillness through the specific calculation that stillness was the best available strategy for a situation that stillness could not solve, which was a different quality than being still, and was visible to someone who knew what to look for. Joran looked at Vorath. He looked at her. He looked at Vorath again. He said he needed to think about it. Vorath said he had until the end of the day. Joran walked across the room and stood in front of her and said, because he had not decided what to do and had decided what not to do, which was leave her in Vorath's back room while he thought about the larger question. "We're leaving?" She looked at him with the calm that would take him several days to fully understand. She did not ask where or why or what the terms were. She walked with him, which was information. They walked through Heth Station's commercial corridors, through the secondary cargo exchange's outer hall, through the connecting passage to the central hub, up 3 levels in the service elevator that was slower than the main elevators and was never watched by anyone whose watching mattered. His brokerage office had a door that locked from the inside and a desk and 2 chairs and a biomedical scanner on the equipment shelf and represented, in the current calculation, the only space on the station that was definitively his and in which he could think. He brought her water. She drank it with the specific quality of someone for whom water had not been consistently guaranteed and who did not want to show that, and was showing it anyway because some things cannot be fully managed when you are trying to manage them. He sat across the desk from her. He looked at the debt, which was 47,000 credits and 11 months of creative non-payment. He looked at her, which was a person in his office, which was a category of asset his brokerage was not equipped to handle and which he was not going to handle as an asset. "I don't know what I'm doing with you," he said, because it was the most immediately true thing, and he had developed, over 11 years of brokerage work, the professional habit of starting with the most immediately true thing. She looked at him across the desk with the calm that was a survival mechanism. "That makes 2 of us," she said. Her standard was exactly correct in the way of someone who had learned it formally rather than by living in it, grammatically precise, tonally calibrated, carrying the specific quality of a language fully acquired rather than fully inhabited. "But I would suggest that you decide before Vorath finds someone whose decision is simpler than yours appears to be." He looked at her. He reached for the biomedical scanner because the scanner was his process for knowing what things actually were before agreeing to any terms, and because she was injured in ways that were not visible, and that he had been watching her not acknowledge since they left the cargo exchange. "This is a medical scanner," he said. "It will tell me whether you need treatment I can provide." She looked at the scanner. She looked at him. "Among other things," she said. He ran the scan. The first section of the results confirmed the injuries he had been watching her not acknowledge. 3 bruised ribs, a healing fracture in her left forearm, old enough to have begun knitting without treatment, which told him something about the timeline and about the treatment she had received, which was none. Soft tissue damage consistent with restraint. He read this section with the flat expression of someone filing information in the category of things to be dealt with in sequence, after the other things were dealt with. The second section was standard Vethali physiology. Expected parameters, normal ranges, nothing that required immediate intervention beyond the injuries already noted. The third section took longer than the first two. He watched the processing indicator run for 4 seconds past the standard completion time, which told him the scanner had found something that required its database to do more work than usual. And then the results populated with the VARETH imperial line notation and the 99.7% concordance figure and the advisory link. He opened the advisory, 37 words. He read them twice. He put the scanner on the desk. He looked at Saris, at the name she had not yet given him, but that he was going to use in a moment. With the specific quality of a person whose professional instincts have been running the numbers while his conscious mind was processing the first 2 sections of a medical scan, and whose professional instincts have just delivered a result that his conscious mind needed a moment to integrate. The Vareth, he knew the name. He knew it the way anyone who had spent 11 years in the cargo and salvage business in this sector knew it, from the Accord's historical database, from the occasional auction of alleged Vareth artifacts that appeared in the commercial exchange records every few years, from the specific and persistent quality of a civilization that had been gone for 200 years and had left behind it an unresolved asset dispute that the Accord's claims registry still listed under disputed, claim unresolved. Review pending. Extinct was the notation in the historical database. Extinct, and underneath it, in the smaller type of an administrative addendum, assets disputed, claim unresolved. Not extinct, said the scanner. He looked at her. She had been looking at him since he put the scanner down, with the calm that was a survival mechanism, and with something underneath the calm that was the quality of someone who knows what the scanner is going to find, and is waiting to see what the person holding it does with the information. Your name, he said. She looked at him for a moment. That was a decision. Saris, she said. That is the name I use. And the full name is considerably longer, she said, and would mean nothing to you without context. Then give me the context. She looked at the scanner on the desk. She looked at him. How much, she said, did you know about the Vareth before this moment? Enough to know that your being alive is not something anyone anticipated, he said, and that the people who didn't anticipate it are going to have opinions about it. Yes, she said, that is an accurate summary. She looked at the advisory still visible on the scanner's display. The question is what you are going to do with the information, and whether you make that decision before or after the people who have been tracking the station's medical database, query log, realize what query was just run and where it was run from. He looked at the scanner. He looked at the door of his office. He thought about the medical database network and its access architecture and the parties on Heth Station who had the credentials to monitor it, because he had spent 11 years learning which parties had which access and for what purposes. He gave them 4 hours, which was the conservative estimate. He started moving. The paperwork for the status conversion took 19 minutes, which was 11 years of knowing the fastest pathway through the station's administrative system compressed into a single transaction. He filed the independent contractor registration under his brokerage credentials, which gave her the minimum legal standing that the Accord's commercial framework provided, which was not much and was more than she had had 11 minutes ago. We're leaving the station, he said while the registration was processing. My ship is in Bay 7, it's fueled. I was planning a cargo run next week. Were you, she said, in the tone that was precise, standard, carrying something that was not entirely serious, which he was filing in the category of information about her that the cargo exchange back room had not had space for. The cargo run is postponed, he said. What is our destination? He thought about the factions. He thought about the Accord's claims process, which was the only mechanism that created legal protection for a Vareth Heir claim, and which required formal filing at Accord Central, which was 4 days transit at the Threnodi's standard speed. He thought about the 4 hours and what happened after them. Accord Central, he said, 4 days. She was quiet for a moment. You are proposing to file the claim yourself. I am proposing to get you to the place where you can file it, he said. There is a distinction. Yes, she said, there is. She picked up her bag, the small one that Vorath's people had allowed her to keep, which he had noted and was now noting differently, because the bag that a captor allows you to keep is either insignificant or significant in a way the captor didn't identify, and Saris was the kind of person who would know the difference. The distinction is appreciated, she said. Bay 7. They walked fast. He used every shortcut he had learned in 11 years. She kept pace with the complete ease of someone for whom his fast walk was a moderate one, which was information of a different category, and which he filed and moved on from because the corridor to Bay 7 had a monitoring point at its junction that he needed them to clear before the 4-hour estimate developed complications. They cleared it. The Threnody launched in the 23rd minute. The Threnody was not a ship that had ever been asked to do anything more significant than move cargo efficiently between points on a commercial route, and it performed this function with the reliable absence of incident that was everything Joran had ever wanted from it. Its passenger compartment was the size of a room that had been designed for cargo and adapted for humans as an afterthought, and it had a table and 2 seats that folded out from the wall and a viewport that looked out at whatever the transit corridor currently offered, which was, for the first 6 hours of the journey, the familiar star field of the Heth Station transit region. He sat across the table from Saris, and they mapped the factions, because mapping the factions was the first thing that needed doing, and because he had learned, in 11 years of brokerage work, that you could not negotiate a situation you hadn't fully inventoried. She knew things he didn't. He knew things she didn't. The inventory assembled together was more complete than either of them could have assembled alone. The first faction was the Accord's Historical Claims Division, which she had known about abstractly and which he could detail specifically. The personnel, the current division chief, the procedural priorities that determined how the division would respond to a formal filing. The Claims Division wanted the Vareth case resolved in a way that was legally clean, and that reflected well on the Accord's management of its unresolved disputes. A legitimate heir appearing with verifiable genetic documentation and filing through the proper channels was, for the Claims Division, the best possible outcome. The Claims Division was therefore an ally, with the significant caveat that the Claims Division moved at the speed of institutional process, which was not the speed of the current situation. The second faction was the Commercial Consortium. She had encountered its agents without knowing their organizational affiliation. He identified the affiliation from her description of their methods, which were consistent with an organization that had been operating in the Vareth trade routes long enough to have developed specific, recognizable techniques for making problems disappear. The consortium had a 40-year provisional administration claim that had been generating revenue every year of those 40 years, and the revenue had made the consortium significant enough that it now had interests in several additional sectors that depended on the stability of its Vareth claim. A confirmed heir made the claim untenable. The consortium's interest was therefore simple and unambiguous and pointed in one direction. "They've tried before," Saris said, with the flat precision of someone reporting a fact about something that had involved them personally. 3 times in the past 18 months. He looked at her, at the healing fracture in her left forearm that the scanner had noted, at the bruised ribs. 3 times, he said. "I am difficult to resolve," she said, with the calm that was a survival mechanism, and he was increasingly certain. Also the delivery vehicle for things that were true and were not entirely serious simultaneously. The third faction she told him last. She told it with the quality of someone who has organized an account around its most difficult element, and has placed the difficult element at the end because the end is where you have the most context for it. Vorath's network was not independent. Vorath's 11 months of creative debt avoidance had not been motivated by the financial creativity that Joran had assumed. Vorath was operating as an agent of a Vethali court faction, a faction that had known about Saris's existence for 3 years, that had been managing her availability through Vorath's network as an intermediary, and that had been waiting for the correct moment to introduce her into a transaction with someone outside their framework who had the right combination of access, motivation, and apparent lack of political sophistication. Joran listened to this. He listened to all of it. He listened to the part about Vorath and about the debt and about the specific design of the transaction in the cargo exchange back room. And he sat with the specific experience of someone who has understood, in one piece, that the situation he thought he had walked into was not the situation he actually walked into, and that the difference between the 2 situations was the entire shape of what had actually happened. "Vorath knew," he said. "Vorath has known about me for 3 years," she said. "The debt was real. The offer was real. Your decision to accept it was," she paused with the precision of someone choosing the right word, "anticipated by the faction. They identified you as someone likely to accept and unlikely to do with the information what they would do with it. What did they think I would do? They thought you would take me to a party they could negotiate with," she said, "or sell the information to the claims division and settle for the finder's documentation fee." She looked at him. They did not anticipate Accord Central in 4 days. He looked at the viewport and the star field, and thought about 11 years of being the person who knew the fastest pathway through the station's administrative system, and the best shortcut to Bay 7, and the way the scanner's processing indicator ran long when it had found something significant. He thought about being anticipated by a Vethali court faction as someone who would not do the complicated thing. "They were almost right," he said. "Yes," she said, "but almost is the distance between their situation and ours." He looked at her across the table. "You said the faction kept you available," he said. "For 3 years, what does that mean specifically?" She told him. She told him with the flat precision of someone who has decided that the information is relevant, and that the person across the table has demonstrated, through a series of decisions that were not the simplest available options, that they are the person to tell it to. She told him about the network of holding arrangements, the managed circumstances, the specific care with which the faction had ensured that she was present and documented and traceable, and not yet in any jurisdiction that allowed her to act on what she was. He listened. He filed it in the category of things to be dealt with, which was the category that the faction's documentation was going to end up in. "I can document this," he said, when she had finished. "The faction's management of your circumstances over 3 years constitutes an Accord treaty violation. The documentation goes into the formal filing as an addendum. It becomes part of the legal record." She looked at him. "You're proposing to use the faction's conduct to protect the filing," she said. "I'm proposing that the most effective way to deal with a faction that anticipated me taking a negotiating position is to take a position they didn't anticipate," he said. "Which is not negotiating with them, which is making their position an evidence exhibit." The calm in her eyes had a quality he was beginning to be able to distinguish from its surface presentation, which was that, underneath the survival mechanism, there was a person who was assessing things with the same methodical attention he brought to cargo manifests, and who had just assessed something in his favor. "That," she said, "is a better plan than the 3 I had." "What were the 3 you had?" "None of them involved Accord Central in 4 days," she said. "All of them involved significantly more personal risk and a lower probability of a clean legal outcome." She paused. "Brokers are useful people." "Occasionally," he said, "the 4 days were work." He called in favors across 3 communication relays, which required routing the transmissions through commercial freight channels that were not monitored for political content, which was a technique that required knowing which commercial freight channels those were, which was the kind of knowledge that 11 years of brokerage work produced as a byproduct. He routed the Threnody through the Karath corridor, which was longer than the direct route and was navigable for a ship with the Threnady's cargo hauler profile, and was not the route that pursuit assets configured for diplomatic transit would look for a cargo hauler to be using. He built the documentation package for the formal filing across the 2nd and 3rd days, working from Saris's account of the Heir claim's legal requirements. She had memorized them, because she had been preparing for this for 3 years, and memorizing the requirements was the kind of preparation available to someone who had access to information and limited access to action, and from his own brokerage knowledge of the Accord's claims filing process, which he had used once, peripherally, in a disputed cargo case, and which he knew well enough to know what the formal filing needed to contain, and in what order. She worked alongside him, not as a subject of the documentation but as a co-author of it, because the Heir claim's legal architecture was something she understood in the specific detail of someone whose survival had depended on understanding it. And the detail she provided was the difference between a filing that would be processed and a filing that would be expedited. She knew which provisions triggered which protections. She knew the precedent cases, cited from memory, that the claims division would use to evaluate the filing. She knew the evidentiary standards for the genomic documentation, which was the claims foundation, and the additional documentation that would make the foundation more stable. "You've been preparing for this for 3 years, he said on the 3rd day, because it was evident and he had a professional habit of naming the evident things. "I have been preparing for 3 years, she said, for the possibility that an opportunity would arise. The opportunity was not predictable. The preparation had to be general enough to be applicable when the specific opportunity appeared." She looked at the documentation on the screen between them. The specific opportunity that appeared was considerably less predictable than my preparation assumed. A broker with a debt and a scanner, he said. A broker with a debt and a scanner and a filing system for decisions about what kind of person to be, she said, with the calm that was the delivery vehicle for true things, which is not a resource I had anticipated. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. He thought about the decision in the cargo exchange back room and the 11 months of debt, and the 4 hours and Bay 7 and the Threnody in the Kareth corridor with its cargo hauler profile navigating through the gap in the pursuit assets coverage. He thought about the filing system for decisions about what kind of person to be, which was not something he had ever described it as and which was, he recognized, accurate. The filing system needs work, he said. It appears functional, she said. It's had 11 years of entries with inconsistent categorization, he said. The Vorath debt was filed under routine commercial relationships for 11 months before I reclassified it. And where was it reclassified to? He thought about this. Something that required the different kind of conversation, he said. The category doesn't have a name, I just know when something belongs in it. She looked at him with the calm that had been, across 3 days, doing things that survival mechanisms did not need to do. Some categories, she said, are more accurately described by their contents than by their names. The formal filing reached Accord Central on the 4th day at the 14th hour, transmitted through the Claims Division's Priority Intake Channel, which Joran had identified on the 3rd day as the channel that processed Heir documentation with the expedited timeline that the filing's protective provisions required. The Claims Division's automated acknowledgement arrived in 4 minutes. The Provisional Protection Status Notification arrived in 6. The Consortium's Administrative Claim Suspension Notification arrived in 22 minutes, which was faster than Joran had expected, and which meant the Claims Division had been watching the Vorath case more closely than the 40-year dormancy implied. The Threnody docked at Accord Central's transit bay 14 hours after the filing. Joran completed the docking paperwork with the thoroughness he applied to all paperwork, because paperwork was the instrument through which things became officially real, and officially real was a different category than actually real in ways that his 11 years of brokerage work had made him understand precisely. Saris was at the passenger compartment's viewport when he finished the docking paperwork and came to stand beside her. Accord Central's structure was visible through the viewport. Large, institutional, the specific architecture of a place that processed significant things by making them procedural, which was the architecture he needed and which was, standing at the viewport of a cargo hauler after 4 days of the Kareth corridor, and 3 factions and documentation built across a folding table, a significant thing to look at. The process, she said, how long? Years for the full resolution, he said, months for the protection provisions to be fully active. He paused. The suspension of the Consortium's claim will hold during the process. The faction's evidentiary position in the addendum will be investigated as a separate matter, which will keep them occupied. Years, she said, with the quality of someone for whom years was being recalculated from a different starting point than it had been a week ago. He looked at the viewport. He thought about the question that a broker asked when a transaction had been structured and filed and submitted. The question of what came next, which was usually another transaction, and which was in this case something that did not fit the category of transaction in any way that his 11 years of brokerage work had a category for. The Vorath trade routes, he said. The Consortium has been running them provisionally for 40 years, running them badly from what the documentation shows, extracting revenue without infrastructure investment, which is the commercial administration equivalent of mining a deposit without shoring the walls. He paused. While the claim processes, those routes need someone who knows the corridor topology and has the Accord registration to operate in disputed territory. She turned from the viewport. She looked at him with the eyes that were calm in the specific way. Calm that had been, across 4 days, becoming the thing that calm could be when survival was not the only thing it needed to manage. You are proposing to establish a brokerage operation in Vorath trade territory, she said, under the claim's provisional protections. I am proposing, he said, that someone with a current knowledge of the trade corridor topology and 11 years of brokerage registration establish a legitimate commercial presence in territory that currently has a consortium running it into the ground under a claim that is now formally contested. He looked at her. It is a reasonable business decision. It is, she said. It is also more than a business decision. He looked at the viewport and Accord Central's institutional architecture, and the specific, patient machinery of a claims process that was going to take years to produce a resolution that was already legally initiated. He looked at Saris, who was looking at him with the full attention of someone who had spent 4 days making an assessment and had arrived at a conclusion. "Yes," he said, "it is." She was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone who has received something true and is present with the receiving of it. "The Vareth trade routes," she said. "They are not simple. The corridor topology was developed over centuries. The commercial relationships that made them viable were built on the Vareth administrative framework, which the consortium dismantled in favor of extraction." She paused. Rebuilding viable commercial relationships in corridors that have been extraction-administered for 40 years requires someone who understands both the corridor topology and the people who use it. "Someone who has been doing brokerage work for 11 years in adjacent territory," he said. "Yes," she said, "and someone who knows the Vareth administrative framework well enough to understand what the commercial relationships need to be rebuilt around." She looked at him. "That is knowledge that currently exists in one place." "Then," he said, "the brokerage has a knowledge resource that the corridor topology alone doesn't provide." "The brokerage would require a partnership structure," she said, with the precision of someone formalizing a term. "A brokerage partnership," he said, "with a Vareth heir who is in the process of a formal claim and has 3 years of legal framework memorized and a comprehensive knowledge of the commercial history of the territory in question." He thought about this with the professional attention he brought to partnership structures, which he had negotiated 11 times in 11 years, and had found, 11 times, that the terms needed to be specific to be functional. The partnership terms would need to be documented. "Yes," she said, "formally registered with the Accord's commercial division." "Yes, and revisited when the claims resolution changes the legal landscape." "Yes," she said, with something in her voice that was precise, standard, carrying the thing that was not entirely serious, which he had learned across 4 days was the register she used for things that were also true. "The terms will require ongoing renegotiation as circumstances develop." He looked at her. He looked at the Threnity's passenger compartment, which was a room designed for cargo and adapted for humans as an afterthought, and which had been, for 4 days, the space where the most significant transaction of his professional life had been built from a folding table and a documentation screen, and the combined inventories of 2 people who each knew things the other didn't. "Ongoing renegotiation," he said. "It is the appropriate structure," she said, "for a partnership with an indefinite timeline." He thought about the claims process and the Vareth trade routes and the consortium's provisional claim suspended, and the faction's evidentiary position in the addendum, and the specific, patient machinery of the Accord's legal process doing the thing that legal processes did, which was take the complicated situation and make it procedural, and leave the people involved with the question of what they did while the procedure ran. "The documentation for the partnership registration," he said. "I can file it through the Accord's commercial division intake while we're docked at Central. The filing would benefit from thoroughness," she said. "My filings are thorough," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have noticed this." Her long ears, which had been in the composed, managed position of the past 4 days, moved, not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality of a significant moment, but with the small, specific quality of something that has been carefully held, releasing the careful holding and becoming simply what it was. "The filing system for decisions about what kind of person to be," she said. "The category that describes its contents rather than its name." He looked at her. "Yes. It has a new entry," she said. "Yes," he said, "it does." Outside, Accord Central processed its significant things by making them procedural, and the Threnody sat in its transit bay fueled for the next leg, and the claims process began its years-long work, and 2 people stood at a viewport in a room built for cargo and used for everything, and the partnership documentation was going to be filed with the thoroughness that the situation required, and the timeline was indefinite, and the terms were going to require ongoing renegotiation, and neither of them had a brokerage category for what that meant, and neither of them needed one.